I need to show you something before I begin. These scars on my body, you can see them. I don't hide them anymore, though it took me 70 years to reach this point where I could show them without shame consuming me entirely. These marks were carved into my flesh by an SS officer named Klaus Zimmermann in a concentration camp in 1944. And what I'm about to tell you over the next hour is not the story you expect. It's not a simple tale of good versus evil, monster versus victim, because what I witnessed in that camp, in those moments of unspeakable horror, was something that haunts me even more than the violence itself. I saw my torturer's humanity. I saw him break down and cry after what he did to me, and that complicated truth has been the burden I've carried for 70 years, trying to understand how a human being can commit atrocities and still have tears, still have a soul somewhere deep inside that knows what he's doing is evil. And I need to tell you this story not because I forgive him, I never will, but because the truth about evil is more complicated and more terrifying than we want to believe. And if we don't understand that complexity, we can't prevent it from happening again. My name is Ruth, and I'm 93 years old now. I've lived an entire lifetime since that day in 1940, for when I was 23 and Klaus Zimmermann destroyed my body, but somehow not my will to survive. I've had children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. I've built a life that the Nazis tried to erase. But that day, those hours, they never leave you. They're embedded in your cells, in your bones, in the tissue that healed wrong, in the nightmares that still come even after 70 years. And I've decided to tell this story now while I still have the strength, because the last survivors are dying. Soon there will be no one left who can say I was there. I saw it with my own eyes. This happened. This is what human beings are capable of when systems of hate are allowed to flourish. I need to take you back to the beginning, to who I was before the war, before the camps, before everything was taken from me, including my fate. Everything changed in September 1939 when Germany invaded Poland. I was 8 years old, and suddenly there were soldiers in our streets, tanks rolling past our bakery. New rules every day that made our lives smaller and smaller. First, we had to wear yellow stars on our clothing. Then we couldn't go to certain places. Then we couldn't own businesses. My father's bakery was taken from him and given to a German family. Just taken. A life's work erased with a signature on a document. Then they created the ghetto, and we were forced to move. Thousands of Jewish families crammed into a few streets, living in buildings that weren't meant to hold so many people, sharing rooms with strangers. My father tried to keep working, doing whatever labor they assigned. My mother tried to keep teaching the children in secret because education was forbidden now. And David and I tried to stay children, even as childhood was being stolen from us day by day. I remember the hunger most of all from those ghetto years. Constant grinding hunger that made your stomach feel like it was eating itself. The rations they gave us weren't enough to survive on. People were dying in the streets from starvation and disease. I watched my little brother get thinner and thinner, his face becoming skeletal, and there was nothing we could do. My mother would give him her portion of bread and pretend she wasn't hungry. My father would work himself nearly to death, trying to get extra food, and still it wasn't enough. Still David got weaker. Still we all got weaker, waiting for something to happen, knowing it would be bad, but not knowing how bad, not able to imagine what was actually coming. The deportation started in 1942. They came with trucks and lists of names, took whole families, told us they were relocating people to work camps in the East. And at first some people believed it, thought maybe it would be better than the ghetto. Maybe there would be food. But then the stories started coming back. Whispers of something worse than we could comprehend. Death camps, not work camps. Places where they were killing Jews by the thousands, by the tens of thousands, industrial murder. On a scale that seemed impossible, and my father said we had to hide. We couldn't let them take us. So he built a hiding space behind a false wall in our room. It was barely big enough for the four of us to squeeze into. We'd hide there when we heard trucks coming, sometimes for hours, barely breathing, trying not to make any sound while soldiers searched the building. We survived like that for months, hiding, emerging, hiding again, watching as the ghetto got emptier and emptier, our neighbors disappearing, until one day in October 1943 they came for our building, and this time they were thorough. They had dogs, they had tools to tear apart walls. They found our hiding place, dragged us out into the street. My mother was screaming. My father tried to fight them, and they beat him with rifle. But until he stopped moving, I grabbed David's hand and held on as tight as I could. I was 12 years old and I knew with absolute certainty that this was the end of everything. This was the moment our family died. And I was right, it was. They loaded us onto cattle cars, packed so tight you couldn't sit down, couldn't move. The smell of human waste and fear was overwhelming. People were crying, praying. Some were already dead, standing up because there was no room to fall. The journey took days. I don't know how many times stopped meaning anything. David was pressed against me, and I could feel his heart beating fast like a frightened bird. My mother was somewhere behind us. I could hear her voice saying, "It's okay. It's okay," even. Though nothing was okay, even though we all knew where we were going, even if we didn't want to say it out loud. And my father, I don't know if he was even conscious after the beating they'd given him. I couldn't see him in that press of bodies. When the train finally stopped and the doors opened, the light was blinding. We tumbled out onto a platform. There were SS guards everywhere with dogs and guns, screaming at us in German to move faster, form lines. And there was a man in an SS uniform standing on a platform making selections with just a gesture of his hand. Left or right? Left or right? Deciding who would live a little longer and who would die that day, though we didn't understand that yet. When our family reached him, he looked at my father, who could barely stand, and pointed left, looked at my mother and pointed left, looked at David, who was so small and thin, and pointed left, and looked at me and pointed right. And just like that, my family was taken from me. They were pulled away into one line while I was shoved into another. I tried to run back to them. I was screaming for my mother, for David, and a guard hit me with his rifle, and someone else dragged me away. And that was the last time I ever saw them, my mother's face looking back at me, David's hand reaching out. My father collapsed on the ground, and then they were gone into the crowd, and I never saw them again, never got to say goodbye, never got to tell them I loved them one more time. I found out later, much later, that left meant the gas chambers, they were dead within hours of arrival. My whole family murdered on the first day while I was sent to the barracks, and for a long time I wished I'd been sent left too. Wished I'd died with them instead of surviving alone. But that wasn't my fate. My fate was to survive, to witness, to carry the story of what happened in that place. And that has been its own kind of burden for 70 years. The camp was hell on earth. I don't know how else to describe it. Rows and rows of wooden barracks, electric fences, guard towers, the constant smell of smoke from the crematorium. We slept on wooden shelves stacked 3 high. Maybe 2 feet of space per person, no mattresses, no blankets. We were given striped uniforms that didn't fit, wooden clogs that gave you blisters. They shaved our heads, tattooed numbers on our forearms. I was no longer Ruth. I was prisoner number 47832, and they worked us 12, 14, 16 hours a day of hard labor, moving rocks from one place to another for no reason, building things that would be torn down and rebuilt. Pointless, exhausting labor designed to break us down. And the food was nothing. Watery soup with maybe a potato, a piece of bread if you were lucky. I was constantly hungry, constantly cold, constantly afraid. Watching people around me die every single day from disease, from starvation, from beatings, from selections where the weak were taken away to be gassed. Every morning we'd wake up to find people dead on the sleeping shelves, frozen or starved, or just given up, and we'd have to carry them out, stack them like wood, and somehow keep going ourselves, somehow survive one more day. I survived for 8 months like that. 8 months of hell. And I don't know how I did it. I was young. I was stronger than I looked. I made myself invisible, kept my head down, did whatever they told me to do. But mostly I think I survived out of spite, out of this burning anger that they'd taken my family, that they'd taken everything, and I wouldn't give them the satisfaction of taking my life too. I would survive just to spite them, just to be a witness, and that anger kept me alive when hope was completely gone. And then came the day that changed everything. It was March 1944. I'd been in the camp for 5 months. I was working in a detail that was clearing rubble from a bombed building, and I saw something I wasn't supposed to see. There was an SS officer doing something with papers, documents he was burning, and I glanced over at the wrong moment and made eye contact with him, and I saw his face change. Saw him realize I'd seen something, and I knew immediately that I was in terrible danger, and I was right. His name was Klaus Zimmerman. I found out later he was in his 30s, tall, blonde, exactly what you'd imagine an SS officer to look like. And he decided that I'd seen too much, that I needed to be dealt with. So that night after roll call, he had me pulled from the line, told the guards to bring me to one of the storage buildings away from the main camp, and I knew what was coming. Every woman in that camp knew the stories of what happened when SS officers took you away. We'd all heard the whispers, we all knew, and I was terrified, but there was nothing I could do. Nowhere to run, no one to help me. I was completely powerless. They brought me to this empty building and left me alone with him. And he started interrogating me about what I'd seen. What did I see him burning? Who had I told? And I kept saying I didn't see anything. I didn't know what he was talking about. Please let me go. And he got angrier and angrier. And then the interrogation turned into violence. He started hitting me. And then he raped me. And I want to be very clear about what I'm telling you. This man raped a 17-year-old girl who weighed maybe 80 pounds and was completely helpless. He used his body and his power to violate me in the most intimate way possible. And the physical pain was terrible, but the psychological destruction was worse. The feeling of being completely dehumanized, reduced to nothing, turned into an object that existed only for his use. And I left my body during it. I went somewhere else in my mind. I looked down at what was happening to that girl on the floor as if it was happening to someone else. As if I was watching from very far away. Because the only way to survive it was to not be there, to split myself in two. The body that was being destroyed and the mind that floated above it all. But the rape wasn't enough for him. After he was finished, he became enraged. I think he was angry at himself, angry that he'd done this, angry that I'd made him do this by seeing what I wasn't supposed to see. That's how their minds worked. They'd blame us for their own evil, and he took out a knife, and he started cutting me, not to kill me quickly, but to mark me, to mutilate me. He carved into my stomach, my thighs, my breasts, cutting symbols and letters into my skin, and the pain was indescribable, beyond anything I'd experienced, even in that place of constant suffering. I was screaming until my voice gave out, and then I was just making these animal sounds, and I thought, this is how I die, this is the end. My family is dead, and now I'll die too, and no one will ever know what happened to me. I'll just be one more number that disappeared. And then something happened that I still don't understand 70 years later. He stopped, he dropped the knife, and he started crying. This SS officer who had just raped and mutilated a teenage girl. He collapsed against the wall and started sobbing, really sobbing, his whole body shaking. And I was lying there bleeding, barely conscious, and I watched him cry. I watched him break down, and he was saying something in German. I didn't understand all of it, but I caught words. I'm sorry, God. Forgive me, what have I become? And I realized with absolute shock that somewhere inside this monster was a human being who knew what he was doing was evil, who felt guilt, who was capable of remorse. And that realization was almost more traumatic than the violence itself, because it meant that the evil wasn't some external force. It wasn't that he was born a demon. It was that he was a human being who had made choices, who had allowed himself to become this, who had murdered his own humanity. Piece by piece, until all that was left was this sobbing, broken thing that had just destroyed an innocent girl. He left me there. He just walked out, left me bleeding on the floor of that building, left me to die, and I should have died. I lost so much blood. The wounds were deep and infected. I was in shock. But somehow, I don't know how, I didn't die. I lay there for hours, maybe drifting in and out of consciousness. And then another prisoner found me, a woman named Sarah who was part of a work detail. She risked her own life to help me. She got others, and they carried me back to the barracks. They cleaned my wounds with water we weren't supposed to have. They tore up their own clothing to make bandages. They hid me from the SS during roll call, told them I was in the latrines, lied to protect me, and slowly, impossibly, I started to heal. The wounds closed though the scars remained, deep, ugly scars all over my body, scars I still carry today, marks that Klaus Zimmermann carved into me to remind me forever that he had the power to destroy me. But I survived, I kept surviving, and 3 months later the camp was liberated by Soviet forces. We woke up one morning and the SS were gone, fled in the night, and Soviet soldiers were there instead, looking at us with horror in their eyes. We looked like walking skeletons. We looked like ghosts, half-dead creatures who somehow were still breathing, and they gave us food, real food, but we couldn't eat it. Our stomachs had shrunk too much. Many people died in those first days of liberation. because their bodies couldn't handle actual food after years of starvation. But I survived that too. I survived everything. I spent months in a displaced persons camp, recovering, trying to find any family members who might have survived. But there was no one. Everyone was gone. My parents, my brother, my aunts and uncles and cousins, an entire family tree cut down and burned. I was alone in the world at 17 years old, scarred inside and out, traumatized beyond measure, but alive. And I had to figure out what to do with that life, whether it was worth living, whether I could build anything from these ruins. I immigrated to America in 1946, started a new life with a new language in a new country. I changed my name, tried to leave the past behind, tried to become someone other than a camp survivor. And for decades, I didn't talk about it. I buried it deep. I got married to a good man who knew something terrible had happened to me, but I never told him the details. I couldn't. The shame was too great, even though I'd done nothing wrong. Even though the shame belonged entirely to my rapist and torturer. But shame doesn't work logically. It attaches itself to the victim, and I carried it like a second skin for 50 years. I had children, 3 beautiful daughters, and I was terrified the entire time I was pregnant with each of them, terrified that the damage done to my body would mean I couldn't carry them, that the mutilation would prevent me from being a mother. But somehow my body worked. Somehow these scars stretched and made room for new life. And when each daughter was born, I held her and cried for joy, but also for grief for the mother I never got to have, for the childhood that was stolen, for the girl I was before Klaus Zimmerman destroyed her. I never told my daughters what happened to me. I told them I was a Holocaust survivor, showed them the tattoo on my arm, told them about the camps in general terms, but I never told them about the rape, about the mutilation, about Klaus Zimmerman. I couldn't bear to see their faces change when they looked at me. Couldn't bear to become my poor mother who was raped in their minds. I wanted to be just their mother, strong and capable and present, not defined by what had been done to me. And so, I carried the secret alone, buried it so deep I almost convinced myself it hadn't happened, that those scars were from something else, some accident, anything but the truth. But trauma doesn't stay buried. It seeps out in other ways. I had nightmares that would wake my husband. I couldn't be touched in certain ways without having panic attacks. I had triggers I didn't understand, certain smells or sounds or situations that would send me spiraling back to that building, to that night, to that pain. And I learned to manage it, learned to function, but I was never free of it, never free of him. Klaus Zimmerman lived in my body, in my scars, in my broken places. He was a ghost that haunted me every day of my life. And then in 1995, 50 years after the war ended, I received a letter. It was forwarded through a Holocaust documentation center where I'd registered my name decades earlier. And the letter was from Klaus Zimmerman. He was 75 years old, living in Argentina where he'd fled after the war, and he was dying of cancer, and he wanted to apologize. He wanted forgiveness. He'd written this long letter detailing everything he remembered about that night, about what he'd done to me, as if I could have possibly forgotten. And he said he'd carried the guilt every day of his life, that he'd never forgiven himself, that the memory of my face haunted him, that he'd become a monster and he knew it and he was sorry, so sorry. And would I please forgive him so he could die in peace? I remember holding that letter in my shaking hands, reading it over and over, feeling something rising in me that I couldn't name at first. And then I realized it was rage, pure undiluted rage. This man who had raped me, who had carved into my flesh, who had left me to die. This man wanted forgiveness from me, wanted me to give him peace, wanted to use me one more time, to absolve him so he could die feeling better about himself. And I thought, how dare you? How dare you ask this of me, you? Don't get to dump your guilt at my feet and ask me to carry it for you. You don't get to take from me one more time. You took everything. You don't get to take my forgiveness too. I wrote him back. It took me weeks to write that letter. I went through dozens of drafts, and finally I sent him a letter that said, I received your confession. I acknowledge your guilt, but I will not forgive you. Forgiveness is not mine to give. You need to seek forgiveness from God if you believe in God, from the universe if you don't, but not from me. I am not your priest. I am not your absolution. I am the girl you destroyed, and I survived you, and that survival is my victory. You do not get To take that from me by making me responsible for your peace. You will die with your guilt, and that is justice, small justice perhaps, but justice nonetheless. I don't know if he received the letter before he died. I never heard back, but writing it freed something in me. For the first time in 50 years, I felt like I had taken back some small measure of power. I had refused him. I had said no to his request, and that no was sacred. It was mine. It was the one thing he couldn't take from me. And after that, I finally started talking about what had happened. First in therapy, then with my daughters who cried and held me and told me how sorry they were. Then in testimony for Holocaust documentation projects. Then in schools and museums, telling my story to anyone who would listen, because I realized that silence serves only the perpetrators. Silence allows them to be forgotten, allows history to be denied. And my story, as painful as it is, as shameful as I felt about it for so long, my story is truth. It's evidence. It's proof of what human beings are capable of when hate is allowed to flourish. And the most important thing I learned, the thing that has taken me 70 years to understand, is that Klaus Zimmermann's tears that night don't redeem him. They don't make him sympathetic. They don't complicate the narrative in a way that suggests both sides have a point. His tears just prove that he knew what he was doing was evil, and he did it anyway. That's what makes it worse, not better. He wasn't an unthinking monster. He was a man who consciously chose to commit atrocities, who murdered his own conscience piece by piece, who cried afterwards because some small part of him still remembered he was human. But those tears didn't stop him, didn't make him help me, didn't make him turn himself in, didn't make him do anything except feel sorry for himself. And I will not waste my sympathy on his guilt. I will not carry his shame. I carried it long enough. It's his to bear, not mine. The scars on my body tell the story of what was done to me. They're a permanent record carved in flesh. But I've learned over these 70 years that scars can tell different stories depending on how you read them. They can be marks of shame or marks of survival. They can be evidence of destruction or proof of resilience. And I choose, every single day I choose, to read them as survival, as evidence that I am still here. That Klaus Zimmermann tried to erase me and failed, that the Nazis tried to exterminate us and failed. 6 million Jews were murdered. My entire family was murdered, but I survived, I lived. I had children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. I have told my story to thousands of people. I have made sure that what happened is documented and remembered and taught. And that is my revenge. That is my justice, continuing to exist, continuing to testify, continuing to say this happened. I was there, I saw it, and we must never let it happen again. I'm 93 years old now. I don't have much time left, maybe a few years if I'm lucky, and I think about death differently than most people probably do. I'm not afraid of it. I've been close to death so many times that it feels almost like an old friend. But what I am afraid of is dying before I've told my story enough times, before I've made sure it will be remembered, because soon there will be no survivors left. Soon there will be no one who can say I was in the camps. I saw the gas chambers. I smelled the smoke from the crematorium. I bore the scars of Nazi torture. And when we're gone, when all the survivors are dead, the deniers will get louder. The people who say it never happened, or it wasn't that bad, or we're exaggerating, they'll get louder because there will be no one to show them the numbers tattooed on our arms, no one to show them the scars on our bodies, no one to look them in the eye and say you're lying. I was there, it happened. So I'm telling this story as many times as I can to whoever will listen. I'm recording it, writing it down, making sure it survives me. And I'm telling the complicated truth, not a simplified version where the Nazis were monsters from another planet and the victims were all saints, but the real truth, which is that the Nazis were human beings who chose evil, who built systems designed for mass murder, who were capable of committing atrocities, and then going home to their families and playing with their children, who could rape and torture a teenage girl and then cry about it as if their tears meant anything, as if remorse without action has any value at all. Klaus Zimmermann's humanity doesn't redeem him. It damns him. It proves that evil isn't something external, isn't something that only affects other people, other countries, other times. Evil is what happens when ordinary humans make extraordinary choices to participate in hatred, to follow orders they know are wrong, to hurt people they've been taught to see as less than human, and the crying afterwards doesn't undo the harm, doesn't bring back the dead, doesn't heal the wounds, it just proves that they knew, they always knew, and they did it anyway. I survived Klaus Zimmerman. I survived the camps. I survived starvation and disease and trauma that should have killed me 1,000 times over. And my survival is not redemptive. It's not inspirational in some simple way. It's just fact. I lived and they died. And I don't know why. I don't know why I was chosen to survive when 6 million others died, when my whole family died, when so many better people than me died. But I did survive. And so I have a responsibility to them, to the dead, to tell their story, to make sure they're remembered, to make sure the world knows what happened in those camps, in those buildings, on those nights when girls were raped and mutilated and left to die. These scars I carry are not just my scars. They're evidence of a systematic program of cruelty. They're proof of what the Nazis did. They're testimony carved in flesh. And I show them not because I'm proud of them, but because they're true. They're real. They happened. And in a world where people increasingly deny history or try to minimize it or say we should move on and forget, these scars say no. You don't get to forget. You don't get to move on. You have to remember. You have to understand what happened so you can prevent it from happening again. And it can happen again. It is happening again in different forms. Genocide didn't end with the Holocaust. Ethnic cleansing didn't end in 1945. Rape as a weapon of war didn't end with the Nazis. It's happening right now in different countries under different flags with different justifications. But the mechanism is the same. Dehumanize a group of people, teach your population to see them as less than human, as vermin, as disease, as threat, and then give permission for violence and ordinary. People will commit extraordinary atrocities. They'll do terrible things and then cry about it afterwards and ask for forgiveness and claim they were just following orders or just doing their job or just caught up in the moment. And we cannot let those excuses stand. We cannot accept tears as redemption. We cannot forgive without accountability. When I think about Klaus Zimmerman now, 70 years after that night, I don't think about him as a monster from a horror movie. I think about him as a human being who made choices, who chose to join the SS, who chose to participate in genocide, who chose to rape me, who chose to mutilate me. A long series of choices that he made consciously. And at the end of his life, he wanted absolution for those choices. He wanted me to tell him it was okay. It wasn't your fault. You can die in peace. And I refused him. And I refuse anyone who tries to humanize perpetrators in a way that minimizes their crimes. Yes, they're human. That's exactly the point. Humans did this. Humans are capable of this. And that means we have to be vigilant. We have to recognize the signs. We have to stand up early before it gets to the point of camps and gas chambers and mass graves. My daughters asked me once why I survived. What was the point of surviving such horror? Was it worth it to live with these memories, these scars, this pain? And I told them, yes, it was worth it. Not because I'm glad it happened, not because suffering made me stronger or wiser or better. That's nonsense. Suffering just makes you suffer. But it was worth surviving because I could be a witness, because I could tell the story, because I could make sure that the world knows what happened, because I could look Klaus Zimmerman in the eye, even across decades and continents, and tell him no. You don't get my forgiveness. You don't get to be absolved. You have to carry what you did, and so do I, but I carry it as survivor and witness, and you carry it as perpetrator and murderer, and that is justice. I've lived 70 years since that night, 70 years of life that he tried to take from me, 70 years of sunrises and sunsets, of loving my children, of reading books, of drinking coffee, of small, ordinary, beautiful moments that are the opposite of everything the Nazis stood for. They wanted to erase us, to eliminate us from existence, and every day I've lived has been an act of resistance. Every time I've smiled or laughed or felt joy has been a victory over them. Every time I've told this story, I've defeated them again. The scars on my body are ugly. They're painful to look at. They're marks of violence and hatred, but they're also proof that I'm still here, that I survived, that their attempt to destroy me failed. And when I die, hopefully not for a few more years, these scars will be gone. My body will be gone, but the story will remain. The testimony will remain. The evidence will remain. And future generations will know what happened. Will know that there was a girl named Ruth who survived the Holocaust, who was raped and mutilated by an SS officer, who refused to give him forgiveness, who lived 70 more years in defiance of everything he stood for, who turned her pain into testimony and her survival into resistance. That's the story I need you to remember, not just the horror, though the horror is important, but the survival, the resistance, the refusal to be silenced or erased, the insistence on truth even when truth is painful, the rejection of easy narratives that make us comfortable, the complicated reality that evil is done by humans who sometimes cry afterwards, but whose tears mean nothing without action, without justice, without accountability. Klaus Zimmerman is dead now. He died decades ago. And I'm still here. I'm 93 years old with great-grandchildren who bear Hebrew names that honor my murdered family, with a life that spans from the depths of human evil to the heights of human resilience. And when I look at these scars now, I don't see his signature. I don't see his mark of ownership. I see my story, my survival, my testimony, my refusal to let him win. And that is how I've lived with this for 70 years, by taking what he tried to use to destroy me and transforming it into the very thing that gives my life meaning. Telling the truth, bearing witness, making sure the world remembers, refusing to let evil be minimized or forgotten or forgiven without accountability. This is my story. This is my testimony. This is my refusal to be silent. And I tell it to you now in the hope that you'll remember it, that you'll pass it on, that you'll recognize the warning signs when hatred begins to rise in your own time, that you'll stand up early before it becomes too late, that you'll refuse the comfortable lies that evil is something that only happens elsewhere to other people, that you'll understand that humans did this, which means humans can prevent it. Humans can stop it. Humans can choose differently, and that is the responsibility we all carry, to remember, to witness, to refuse to look away, to say never again and mean it, to honor the 6 million who died and the survivors who live by making sure it never happens again. And that is why I'm still here at 93 telling this painful story, because memory is resistance, testimony is justice, and survival is victory.